Okay, everyone, we'll get started here in just a minute or two. Okay, everyone, uh, just before we get started here, I guess there was a problem with the link from the archives from Monday, but I just put up a YouTube link to it, so in the announcements, so you can check that out later. And just a heads up, this will probably be a little bit of a shorter session today, but just a couple reminders before we get started. Remember the reading assessment, if you haven't done it yet, is due by tonight. And also the timed essay will be due Sunday, but I'll put it up today. You can take it anytime, but it's not really a quiz, it's just a little mini essay. So I'll give you some topics, a couple of which you'll probably already know about. And before doing anything though, I just want to show you this. This was sent by the Writing Center. And in fact, I think in our, maybe hopefully next week sometime, we're going to coordinate where they can actually come in and talk to you about the Writing Center for about 15 minutes. Right now, I mean, these are instructions. Earlier, it wasn't letting me on. Yes, I don't know necessarily why. I think I have to reset my password, but these will be the instructions about how you can access the Writing Center in Canvas. And so you see here, now the thing is with the Writing Center, I'm not sure exactly if they're on campus yet, or I assume they probably are, but I'm not sure at all the campuses, but you can set up virtual meetings with them. You can, I know that like at the Altamont campus, you could just walk in anytime. And as long as they weren't busy with somebody else, they were there to help you with any kind of writing help. I mean, obviously they're not going to write your paper for you, but they can give you some tips and so forth. So hopefully we'll have them in here at some point soon, hopefully by next week. And I mean, they can kind of go through all these things with you. But there you can see the instructions about how to get in. You would connect to the online tutoring at Academic Success Canvas. So you would go to there, and it looks like you can set up an appointment. And I think you can even submit, you can see here, you can submit your paper to a tutor and they can get back to you on that. So anyway, and then later today, we'll also go through an example of a student paper from last semester that's basically identical to one of the topics you could write for their paper next week when you do your first paper. So it's about the student's major, in this case, nursing. And we'll take a look at that later. But today, there's not really too much that we'll get into. The pages that I had you read, essentially, I know that they kind of overlapped. 161 started on the last page of the last chapter and it kind of bled over, but that's okay. We'll cover the bulk of what we talked about, or what we're going to talk about for this week's readings. Okay, so what your authors say about entering a class discussion, it's kind of a metaphor for addressing authors when you're writing a paper. I know that for most of you, you don't have any face-to-face classes this semester, and it's kind of looking like that. It might be the same thing for next semester. I know that, for example, at UCF, they only have like 20% of their classes face to face at this point, and most of those are technical classes where it's more hands-on. And it looks like next semester it might be more remote classes like this, sort of online and not face to face, or at the very least, maybe a hybrid version of a class where it's partially online and partially in the classroom. So for example, there'll be an online component and then you might go to class 1 day a week or something like that. But we'll see. It's looking like there are a few vaccines coming out pretty soon, but even if they come out, say next month or November, December, even then, it's not looking like everybody might have access to the vaccines, or just for a variety of reasons, we might not have a vaccine at that point, unfortunately. So it's maybe looking like many of your classes next semester might be online. But for the sake of being hypothetical here, let's just talk a little bit about when you go into a classroom and you are having discussions, class discussions. You want to frame, your authors talk on page 163, how you want to frame your comments as a response that somebody else has already said. Now, your authors are a little bit optimistic, I would say, in the sense that a lot of class discussions don't always develop that way. Usually one student or one person will say one thing, and then another person will say something totally different. But ideally, you want to have your class discussions as one person says one thing, another person comments on that, agrees, disagrees, then somebody else comments on that, agrees, disagrees, maybe has a different spin on it, and then before moving on to the next question. But so ideally, that's how it should be. Sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Now, in terms of online discussions, this class that you're taking right here was set up to be a face-to-face class, so we don't really have discussion boards on campus. Some of your classes might. Maybe next semester, this class will have more class discussions on the online forum and so forth. But even then, you want to have discussions that comment on what somebody else has already said. Now, ideally, that's how it should work. But I can tell you that a lot of times when you have assignments, you have discussions that are due. Let me put this in full screen for a second. When you have discussions in an online forum, a lot of times they're due Sunday nights by midnight. So what happens is students will wait until like Sunday, and then there'll be very little from Monday to Saturday, and then everybody before 11:59 will just rush to get their discussion in. So it doesn't always work out that way, but in an ideal setting, you want to talk about what somebody else has already said, maybe comment on what they said, whether you agree, disagree, or here's something else to consider, something like that. And you want to be more explicit in your writing though. When, or I'm sorry, I got that backwards. You want to be more explicit when you're addressing somebody, you're talking, because listeners can't really go back and forth and reread or hear what you said. And I mean, unless it's being recorded. So you want to be more explicit than you would be in writing in a classroom discussion. Because if you're writing something on an online discussion forum, well, you can go back, see what the writer said, look at some sentences, and then comment on those. Now, it is true, though, in media, whether we're talking about television or any form of media, these days it seems like everything is recorded. And not just media, but anything that's going on outside. People all have cell phones, everything can be recorded and then put on YouTube, given to news networks, etc. And this is true. There's something called a hot mic, which is where somebody is saying something, they don't know that the microphone is on, or they don't think it's going to be picked up. And this is, I mean, examples include, President Trump, where before the last election, he was caught saying derogatory things or misogynist things about women. And whether he knew he was being recorded or not, he didn't think that years later it would come up. And the same thing is true with Biden one time, because Biden one time used the F word, like saying that this is a big effing deal. And he didn't think that that would be picked up, but of course it did. And the same thing is true, Obama, George W. Bush, they've all said things that they didn't think would be picked up and used by their opponents. But of course it was. And the same thing is true if you're a political pundit. That doesn't have to necessarily be a hot mic, but think about if you're a pundit, or sport pundit, political pundit, whatever. If you make your living talking for an hour or doing a show for an hour every single weekday for a year, of course, you're going to say things here and there that maybe you regret or that you didn't say properly. So of course, that's going to be used by your opponents. I think I can think of a sports example, for instance, where a guy named Rob Parker, if you're into sports, he's kind of a funny guy, but he said some negative things about, it was a quarterback named Robert Griffin III, which he's still in the league. I'm not sure who he plays for now, but he was a Washington Redskins quarterback. And Rob Parker said some things that he probably wish he didn't had said, and it ended up getting fired. And I mean, we could have a whole hour-long discussion about some examples of how people say things in recorded media that later on people use against them, and they can get fired or what have you, right? So media, everything is recorded these days, it seems like, but in a classroom setting, things are not always recorded, so you can't really go back, and if you're going to be commenting on what somebody said in class, well, you have to remember it. It's not written down or it's not recorded necessarily. I mean, some classes are, I guess, but also your textbook talks about making clear who you are responding to. So what that means, I mean, they give the example of a Nicholas Carr essay, but when you are writing a paper, sometimes you are citing multiple authors. So you have to be clear about which author you're addressing all the time. Now, in the classroom setting, I will tell you, of course, I think that your authors in the textbook are a little bit more optimistic, because when you are in a classroom for the very first time, you don't really know who your classmates are. So it's not always clear, you know, if Anna says this or Mark says that, you don't know their names necessarily. But when, of course, by the end of the semester, maybe you are, but even in an online discussion forum, just make clear who you are responding to. I can think of an example in my class last semester in Canvas, the class I was taking. Unfortunately, Canvas was having some issues last semester where if you reply to somebody, you couldn't reply to them. You had to go all the way down to the bottom. But so in that case, you want to make clear, you know, if your post isn't going to be in a thread with goes back and forth, and you can reply to the person that you're replying to directly, and it goes all the way down to the bottom where you can reply. Just make clear about who you're responding to. Okay, and then on page 171, they talk about, or they give you some examples of that. You know, what so-and-so says or what so-and-so overlooks is that this, or what both X and Y fail to see is that this, and so forth. So it gives you a template there. Also, they explain on page 172 how you can link to what they say. So many of you are familiar with, obviously with Canvas, you can actually link in or embed links into your discussion post, which means, and we're not just talking about Canvas or for a classroom setting, but if you have a blog, for instance, you can embed hyperlinks. So if you are responding to another author and you are citing another author, and then you have to cite that at the bottom, or you can actually include links to the article or the essay that you're responding to, so that your reader can just simply click on that link. It'll take them directly to the person that you're citing, and it makes it easier for them. So using links can be important. And they give you some examples here, page 172, about how you want to take or juxtapose what they say with what you say. So, I mean, they give you some examples here. According to Lee, and then he talks about the Carr article, and then Cody responds, like Lee, and so forth. And then another example they talk about on page 173 about Twitter, right? When you're on Twitter, you can reply directly or explain exactly and link who you're responding to. And then they give you some exercises. We're not going to go through them, but some exercises on 174 and 175 that you can look at. And the thing that you want to remember, though, when you're reading an article or an essay, don't think of that author's argument as just an isolated entity. So what they say is always a response to something else. And it can also provoke other people's arguments. It's a never-ending conversation. What I mean by that is if you take an instance of gun shooting, somebody gets shot and you see it on the news. Well, an author might briefly cite that, but that might lead to a whole discussion about gun control. So for example, they might have an essay about how, oh, well, guns should be restricted more. And then the reverse example might be where you hear on the news about somebody that, or like a burglar or a robber that breaks into somebody's house and with a gun, and they try to rob them. And the person that's being robbed might have a gun and they shoot them to protect themselves. And then that could be a whole argument for how guns should be more available to people, or the Second Amendment is not such a bad thing, et cetera. And the same thing, you can, let me just move my chat box here for a second. And remember, if you have any questions or comments, just feel free to type in the chat box or to hit your talk button. But some other examples might be domestic violence. There might be something that you see about on the news about maybe a woman who experienced domestic violence. And it might be one isolated case, but somebody might write a whole essay talking about the issue of domestic violence. So the point is that it's kind of a never-ending conversation. And an author, what they're writing about, even they're talking about domestic violence, they might be commenting on something else that just happened. So an argument or an essay is not always about it's not an isolated entity. I also mentioned the book Freedom by Jonathan Franzen. Well, of course, the book itself is very good. It got great reviews and everything, but the overall theme of that book is about overpopulation and how that can contribute to global warming. I mean, the author, Jonathan Franzen, doesn't come out and say that directly, but the point is that somebody might read that book and write a whole essay about the issue of overpopulation. Even if they cite Franzen just briefly, it can lead to other responses. And then somebody might have the counter argument and say that overpopulation is not a huge issue or not a huge problem at this point. You could also take a look, for example, at the California wildfires that are taking place right now. And I'm sure that a lot of you are aware, in California, they're having huge issues with wildfires. Well, somebody could take what's going on and they could say, oh, well, this is an example of global warming, and write a whole essay on that. And then somebody could take the reverse position, responding to that author, that writer, and say, hey, that's not really the main issue. The main issue is bad forest industry policies and things like that. So the point, though, is that what they say is usually a response, or almost always a response, to what something else that's happening or what something else has said. Okay, also on page 183, I just want to briefly cite this. So Judith Butler is a famous feminist author, and she's talked a lot about LGBT issues and so forth, but sometimes she's hard to read. And a lot of these academic scholars that you'll find when you do research, sometimes they are hard to read. And ideally, they should be more explicit in what they're saying, but sometimes it can be hard to understand exactly what they're saying. So in this case, she says, contemporary feminist debates over the meaning of gender lead time and again to, wait, let me move my chat box for a second. Leave time and again to a certain sense of trouble, as if the indeterminacy of gender might actually culminate in the future failure of feminism. Perhaps trouble not need such carry negative valence. So if you're not sure about some of these words, it always helps maybe to go back into the dictionary and just take these words line by line. So contemporary feminist debates, meaning modern feminist debates over the meaning of gender, lead time and again to a certain sense of trouble, as if the indeterminacy or impossibility to understand gender might eventually culminate in the failure of feminism. Perhaps trouble need not carry such negative valence or effects. Essentially, what she is saying is that what people think before about these debates and the meaning of gender usually lead to a sense of trouble, most people think, but actually trouble need not carry such negative effects or meaning, essentially. So the point of this is that I'm saying that if you're not sure about what an author is saying, especially later on when we look at academic articles and so forth, they are hard to read. I mean, there's an author, well, he's not alive anymore, but Jacques Derrida and some of these other French philosophers can be very hard to understand. In fact, even to this day, not a lot of people know what Jacques Derrida said. A lot of scholars, a lot of academics don't know exactly what Jacques Derrida says or means. So it can be very confusing at times, but do your best. And if you're not sure of words, you can look in the dictionary. These days, of course, you can just go to dictionary.com, and it's easy to look up words that you don't understand and just try to do your best to make meaning of what the author is saying. That's kind of the point of that, I believe. And then also keep in mind that when you're reading a text, you can look at a text, a book, for instance, from a strictly formalist standpoint. And you could say, oh, well, this is a good book. But also try to get a sense of what the author was motivated by for their book, their argument, not just books, but I mean essays too. But for example, I put down like Harry Beecher Stowe as an example, and Mark Twain, who oddly enough were next door neighbors at one point. It's kind of weird that they were these two famous abolitionist authors ended up like living right next to each other, and they became friends and everything. But Harry Beecher Stowe, of course, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was very influential, as I think we've talked about in the previous class. But you also should look deeper as to what led Harry Beecher Stowe to write that book. And of course, the theme of the book is how slavery is evil, which is obviously true. And it, just from a formal standpoint, it's pretty good book, good characters, very good plot, very good message. Okay, so what led her to do that? Well, if you look at her biography, she grew up not necessarily in a slave owning family, but later on she got to explore the world or explore other parts of the South, and she viewed slavery, or she got a chance to see slavery up close, particularly how children were separated from their parents and how children were sold away from their parents. And that kind of led her to write that book. So it wasn't just about the thesis or the argument about slavery, but it was also about what she saw, what motivated her. Same thing with the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because Mark Twain, now some people think incorrectly that, oh, that's a racist book because it uses the N-word so much. But it really, that's not the way to interpret the book. It was actually the opposite. Mark Twain saw slavery and wanted to comment on that and wrote a very anti-slavery book. But the point is that it's not just a great book in general, but look at what the theme is, anti-slavery, and what led Mark Twain to write that book. Okay, so on page 188, they don't even worry about the video game part of it, but I wanted to just show you a couple things about this example that they give you, page 188. It's the content here, which isn't that important for this, but it's about video game addiction. And a couple things here. Notice how the little passage here, this is the introduction, it starts out with a question. Remember, you can use a question to start off your essay. So they say, these two authors, is video game addiction a real thing? Question. And then they start a new paragraph here. And the first paragraph goes into how it is, or how some people think it is, video game addiction is a real thing. And then their thesis, though, is actually in the third paragraph. This is all terribly misguided, okay? The point I want to make, though, is that for most of your essays that you're going to be doing, your thesis will be in the last sentence of the first paragraph. But I just want to point this out, though, because when you're reading longer essays from scholars and from other academics, a lot of times they don't really follow the rules that they teach in freshman English. So sometimes the thesis might be not in the first paragraph, but maybe in the third paragraph. So just keep that in mind when you are reading these articles. And remember, sometimes And I'm not saying that you can't do this. So sometimes you can break the rules if it's done well, right? And then on page 190, they give you this example of clarifying something from the past and comparing it to now. So once again, the content is important here, but they talk about how 15 years ago, Milton Friedman's treatise, 1957 treatise, seemed badly dated. But then they say that, hey, actually, today, that person's ideas don't look too incorrect. So they're taking something from the past and comparing it to now. So, I mean, just right off the top of my head here, just say that, well, in the 1400s, everybody thought the earth was flat. Today, that seems outdated. I mean, that's a very generic example, but sometimes you clarify something from the past and compare it to now. Also, page 195, they talk about how when you are writing an essay, particularly in this class and all other English classes, but just college classes in general, try to find gaps in the research. And what I mean by that is, once again, just off the top of my head, let's just say that you're talking about the coronavirus vaccines that are, some of them are in the last few stages. From what I understand, 3 of them are in the very last stages. They have to, of course, go through some trials. They're in their trials though, and they just have to make sure that they're safe so that you don't, somehow grow a 6th finger or something like that. But hopefully we'll have a vaccine soon. But let's just say that you are looking at what most scientists are saying now is that there are 3 main vaccines. I think the one that they're talking about most is one called from Moderna, I believe it is. But let's just say that you're looking at the research and you're saying that most of the research says that these 3 vaccines are the ones that might come into fruition very soon. But then you say, well, wait, there's this other one that scientists are not talking about. So you're finding gaps in the research that's going on, and you're maybe putting your own spin on it. I mean, whatever topic that you're talking about. I use vaccines as an example, but other subjects, you could find research, you could find what the research is and find gaps in it and how you can maybe fit your argument in there. And then they give you an example like literature review. Okay, they have templates here of how you can use literature reviews. And like in this class, probably we're gonna have an annotated bibliography, but a literature review would be basically taking that annotated bibliography and turning it into an essay form. That's kind of what a literature review is. And a couple things though about this. Explain how you got your data if you're doing a study. And they give you an example on page 200 where these authors explain, again, the content doesn't matter here, but in the second part here, they say, we began by selecting the appropriate newspaper for each House race in 2010 and 2014. And then they tell you next paragraph, our data collection efforts produced 10,000 or whatever are stories about 1,500 candidates, etc. So they're explaining how they're conducting their study. They also give you an example too on page 201. The author starts out, in this study, I used data from the General Social Survey and Structural Equation Model. So the point is that they're explaining how they did the research. So for example, let's just say that you are doing a survey and you want to know what college students think about whatever the topic is. Should college be free? Or is college for everyone? So let's just say that you want to do a survey to see what college students think. So what you would do maybe is that if you're taking, once again, a face-to-face class, you would be on campus. So let's say you have a, I don't know, a 9 o'clock class and you want to just real quickly do a survey. Hey, what do you think about this issue? Is college for everyone? What do you think? And you survey maybe 20 students. You get there early in the morning where you catch students on their way to class and you ask them, what do you think about this issue? And so you get your results. You interviewed or you surveyed 20 students, and then you use that in your paper. So you would explain exactly what you did. I got to campus early. I interviewed or surveyed students that came to class right before my class at 9 o'clock, and I just asked them a simple question. That's how you got your results. That's how you did your survey. But also, you want to keep in mind, explain the shortcomings of your study. That's not a bad thing, by the way. In fact, it's actually makes your argument more credible. So I just pulled this. This is from our library. And again, don't worry about the content here. You know, it's about paradigm shifts in sexual health, quantitative analysis. So whatever, the article doesn't matter, but I want to show you a couple things here. They, okay, so they explain how they did their methods, and they have graphs and charts and so forth. So they're kind of explaining what they did. But then down here, I just want to point out this, limitations. So they're talking about the limitations of the study and maybe suggesting further research that could be done about the topic. That's not a bad thing, to discuss the shortcomings of your survey or your analysis, whatever it might be. And so, for example, if we go back here and we're using the example I just gave about surveying college students about what they think about should college be for everyone, well, explain the shortcomings of your study and just say that, hey, it would be impossible to survey every college student in the country. Or even taking this further, let's just say you're doing it on Seminole State College. You simply say that, hey, I wasn't able to go to all 4 campuses and survey every single student out there. I just did what we call a convenience study, where I just simply went to campus early and I was able to survey 20 students. The shortcomings of the study would simply be that it's limited. You only interviewed 20 students out of however many thousands that go here, and that could lead to further research. You could say, well, I did it on the Altamont campus, but somebody else might want to try this on the Sanford campus. So you're explaining the shortcomings of your study, and the same thing is true when you see all these polls these days, especially around the time of a presidential election. You see all these polls. Well, the limitations or shortcomings of their study would simply be the fact that most of these polls actually just interview or survey about 500 people out of a nation of 330 million people. So the shortcoming of that might be that simply that you're only taking a very tiny sample of the American electorate. So, and ideally in situations like that, you would want to have random samples. So how they do that, the pollsters do that actually, is that a computer actually randomizes certain phone numbers, and then that's who they call. And of course, these days, a lot of people don't answer unlisted calls because it'll be like an unlisted number. So that could be a shortcoming too, is that, hey, the people that we initially tried to call didn't answer their phone. So, hold on one second here. Okay, and then your authors talk about on page 204, what is the point? Why should we care about the issue, especially in the social sciences, which when you're dealing with human subjects? What is the point? Why is this study to be taken seriously? And then, as I mentioned, further suggestions. So to use that example again about if you're surveying Altamont, the Altamont campus, well, a further suggestion would be to take your results and then possibly go to other campuses and see if the results compare. Okay, so we can get into vocabulary words, but I didn't do that. I forgot to do that with the last class, but I want to show you a couple things here. First of all, let me see here. Give me 1 second here. Okay. This textbook actually has an official site called theysayiblog.com. That's theysayiblog.com, you see. And they have different categories here on the right side. I will tell you that some of these articles are a tad bit dated, or sometimes they can be dated. I mean, well, this one's pretty close, I mean, 2020, but some of them are not so dated. But this is an example of interesting article that I just found randomly just yesterday. And maybe something like this, because you're authors here will give you possible topics. So just keep in mind that maybe one of these topics, one of these articles, not necessarily this one that I'm going to be talking about right now for a second, this hypothetically could be like the topic of the next essay, this essay number 2, but we'll see as we get there. But let's just take a look here. Very interesting article, and I mean, they have different things on the right-hand side that you can, different categories and so forth. This article is pretty interesting, how vaccine nationalism could block vulnerable populations' access to COVID-19 vaccines. So the thesis of this article is that, unfortunately, even though it's good that we're going to be having all these vaccines, or we might have one vaccine, the problem is, what if one country gets exclusive rights to that vaccine? Well, of course, the danger in that is that they could overcharge its own citizens, first of all. It could overcharge other countries. And that's something to consider. I mean, they go through various different countries that are trying to get exclusive rights to that. I mean, ideally, in a perfect world, we would have the vaccine, everybody in the planet would have access to it, and at an affordable cost, or maybe even free. But that might not happen. And they give you the example here. If you go down here, when they were looking at A1N1 or H1N1 in 2009, you can see here that only when the 2009 pandemic began to unwind and demand for a vaccine dropped did developed countries offer to donate vaccine doses to poorer economies. So the idea that they're trying to emphasize here is that one country might get the vaccine, but it might be limited for at least a while. So it's going to provide its own citizens with the vaccine, but then other countries might not have access to that until later. So that's, anyways, just wanted to pull this up and just show you how our textbook has its own website here called, let me go back to the main page here. It's just called They Say I Blog. Okay. Now, let me just show you an example of a student paper from last semester, and we're going to do this often, where sometimes we'll look at what previous students have done and look at some of the mistakes that they made. So just right off the top, what is one thing that you noticed that's incorrect about this essay? Just look at the title here. Well, I'll just tell you.
It's more of an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, what would you say is wrong with this title?
Like, I think it's more of it's more of an opinionated, so it's not really going to be like, if you were trying to go for like an argumentative essay, it's too like one-sided in a way. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay. Okay, that's a good point, arguably, that maybe it's too opinionated. In this case, I think the title is, I mean, this could be an example of a decent title, but just grammatically, okay, yeah, okay, Jose, you nailed it, that these main words need to be capitalized. Now, Hunter asked a good question too, that it's not underlined. Actually, for MLA format, you don't need to underline the title. Well, no, Shiloh, it's, no, for MLA, Times New Roman 12-point font is the right font. So that's a good question though, because some people think, well, should we blow up this font or make it bigger? You know, like we'll make it 16. And then some people think, well, it should be underlined. Actually, that's wrong. A lot of people think this, and of course, you know, if you're reading an article in a magazine or something like that, or a newspaper, yeah, the title is bigger in bigger font. But for MLA, it is 12-point Times New Roman. But yeah, as Jose said though, it's not capitalized the major words here. Also, now, just a couple things here about this thesis. I mean, you could see there are some typos here, but For this example, this is fine for the first paper, and I guess, we've talked about qualifying your thesis. In a situation like this, it's a little bit tricky because who is going to argue that nursing is not important? So in a situation like this, you wouldn't necessarily have to qualify it too much. I mean, technically, what you could say perhaps is something, you could say right here before this, you could say, while some people think that a psychology major or a IT major is the most important field or some of the most important fields to get into, one field that doesn't get talked about enough is the nursing major or something like that. So you're kind of explaining that somebody could disagree with you, but you're kind of qualifying your thesis that way. Once again, though, for first paper, it's okay to just say something like this, I would argue, because who's going to disagree that nursing isn't important? But the thing I would say, though, is that once again, this is okay for the first paper, but if you want to, you could make this thesis a little bit more ambitious because this is very simplistic. Once again, nobody's really going to argue with it. If you wanted to maybe make your thesis a little bit more ambitious, let's just start with this part right here. The nursing profession has been around since the Roman Empire and is still just as important, or even more so today. So maybe the thesis could be something like, while many people think that nursing is just a modern major or something that's important in modern times, it turns out that it's been around since the Roman Empire, so it's been around for decades and decades and decades. And you could maybe build your paper around that. And then you could, from this second sentence, you could say, okay, so the author says, nurses have many jobs in the medical field and even outside the medical field. So you could maybe build your argument around this. Your thesis could be something like, well, many people think that nurses have jobs in the medical field only. It turns out that nursing students, nursing majors can get jobs even outside of the medical field. Okay, so I'm kind of nitpicking this a little bit. I mean, but this is still a pretty good thesis. It's just maybe a little bit simplistic. And then let's just kind of go down here. I just want to draw your attention to a couple things here. So anytime that Microsoft Word underlines something, whether it's in red or it's in blue, it usually means that there's a mistake there. Not always, but usually. So obviously in this, of course, I is not capitalized. So you just right click, or if you're using an Apple control click, and it'll bring up usually the first option, which will correct it. Same thing here. If you're just reading this, of course, my and self are spelled correctly as a separate thing here, but technically myself would be one word here. So myself, you just right click and then it'll give you the correction. Same thing here, you read it, and if they are able to move without assistance, okay, that reads okay, but you see here that there's an extra space. So you would just click on that and it'll give you the correction. And then just the last thing to point out here, we'll get into MLA next week, but so you'll have like a running head here and a page number. This is correct up here. But just the last thing to point out here is that you can tell that this student probably did this kind of at the last minute probably, or the last day, because it's a little bit short. Remember, you want to have at least 3 full pages here. And this is only about 2 1/4 or something like that. So just wanted to give you that example. And then, like I said, we'll end here a little bit early. Just trying to think if there's anything I'm missing. Okay, let me just, actually, I'll just give you the vocab words here in a second, but before doing that, in the last class, somebody was asking about the reading assessment for this week that's due tonight, if you haven't done it already. Don't overthink it too much. I mean, these are very simple. If you want to think of it as just as response, like personal responses or blog responses, these reading assessments are not too difficult, so don't overthink it. So the second question I think is about why is it important to qualify your thesis? Well, you can simply say because you don't want to give absolute like arguments all the time that nobody could possibly disagree with. You know, the sky is blue. Nobody's going to disagree with that. So that's the importance of qualifying a thesis. And then like a perfect example that you could give for that would be about, should college be free for everybody, or is college good for everybody? Should everybody have college for free? Should everybody go to college? And just simply give an example about how, you know, while some people think this, they are slightly incorrect because of this. So you don't have to overthink it too much. And so real quickly, just some vocab words for this week. So belie, and how you could give this an example. Belie just simply means to hide. So you could say something like, her trembling hands belied her calm voice. So her hands hid her calm voice. Chicanery just means trickery, particularly to get some type of gain. So whether it's political, monetary, etc. So the politician was using his typical chicanery or trickery to boost public opinion. So deception. Okay, Carrie, great question. Do you post the PowerPoints? Well, since these are recorded, I don't know if, I mean, I guess I could. The only thing is, I'll be honest, I'm kind of doing, like you can see here, I have over 200 slides at this point, and some of these are from a previous textbook, so I'm kind of doing these as I go. I could post the PowerPoints, but you could, the only thing to note on that though is that just keep in mind the point that we're at for each class. So for example, I mean like down here, okay, so for example, down here, it's gonna say something like narrative mini essay assignment. That's actually for a different class. That's where you would tell a personal story. So I'm kind of redoing these PowerPoints as I go. But also just keep in mind that since these are recorded, you can always go back and check these out. Just pause and then go to the next slide, etc. So let me go back here for a second. Facetious just means to be sarcastic or silly in some way. So the coach wasn't being facetious. He wanted his players to take a cold shower before the game. So he wasn't trying to be sarcastic or silly. He really did want his players to take a cold shower before the game. And okay, so reciprocal just means to like mutual benefits, right? So for example, the two sides had a reciprocal relationship as each benefited from the other's policies. And lastly, totalitarian, which means like authoritarian. So for example, some governments have totalitarian laws that deny essential rights for its citizens. So totalitarian is kind of like authoritarian in a sense. Okay, and then next week we'll get into a Lamont article. This isn't from the textbook, or this isn't one of your essays, but I think it's pretty good. It's just called Shitty First Drafts, which essentially states that when you write a first draft, it's probably not going to be good. That's where you go back and you simply would edit it and so forth. But we'll talk about that in a future class, probably next week actually. So I'm trying to think, are there any other questions? I know we'll probably end a little bit early today, but any other questions that you might have? And so remember, just for this week, if you haven't done the reading assessment by tonight, make sure to do that. And then remember that we'll have the timed essay. The topics, I'm not sure if somebody asked in this class or it was the last class, the topics, I'll probably give you like 3 or 4 choices. So one of them might be what you've already talked about. Should college be free for everyone? Or is college for everyone? That might be one of the questions. And then last time, I gave you the example of how this animal, Rocky the bear, killed somebody, and there was this big debate about should that animal have been euthanized? What do you think? Yes or no? And particularly in that case, that Rocky never had an incident before that, never had an incident after that. He was trained. And another time, I'll give you some other topics as well, probably. And the time essay, will we meet on Zoom first, or what will happen? No, Hunter, what will happen is that after this class today, I'll put up, or like later this afternoon, I'll put up the timed essay, and then you'll just take it on your own, essentially. The thing I would just say, and then you'll have by Sunday to do it. You can do it any time, but just make sure to do it by Sunday. The only thing to say about that too is just remember, and this doesn't just apply to this class, and it doesn't just apply to like a mini essay. I think it might say timed quiz. Somebody was asking in the last class. It's actually just a mini essay. But just the thing to remember with timed work is that you want to make sure to finish, whether it's an essay or even a multiple choice quiz or test, because I've seen this happen where sometimes students will spend too much time on the beginning part and then they'll run out of time. Or if it's a multiple choice quiz, for example, and let's just say that the test is, I don't know, 45 questions and you have an hour to do them. Well, sometimes students will spend too much time thinking on the first 20 questions or 25 questions, and then they'll end up not completing it by the time, when the time is up. So just remember to, take your time, of course, and you'll see the instructions and everything. And oh, by the way, too, when you see the instructions, because this has happened in the past, where in the classroom, the instructions might say something like write down on a sheet like an outline, and you don't have to turn that part in, and you're not going to have to anyways. This is an online. So sometimes students will say, do I need to turn in this outline too? No, you don't have to. The outline part is just like a suggestion to maybe help guide your essay. But yeah, it's not going to be difficult. Just make sure to complete it. Make sure to have paragraphs. So in the past, sometimes students will just like write one long section without any paragraphs. I mean, make sure to have paragraphs, make sure to have an argument in there, make sure to have a good conclusion, essentially. So it's not going to be too difficult. Make sure that you're using good spelling and grammar. This is actually a good thing for you in an online setting compared to the classroom, because you can do it on Microsoft Word if you want. And remember, Microsoft Word will fix grammatical and spelling errors. Whereas if you're writing it down in the classroom, you're not able to do that. So you can turn it in through Microsoft Word as an attachment, or just type it right there in the text. Actually, I take that back. It might require an attachment, PDF or a Word document. Okay, so any other last minute questions? Okay, if not, we'll end for this week. Everybody have a good weekend. We'll meet again on Monday.